The first light of June 6, 1944 crept across the English Channel like a reluctant witness to history. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder pressed his binoculars against the salt-stained glass of the landing craft, watching. The dark silhouette of the French coastline emerged from the pre-dawn gloom. Behind him, 225 Rangers of the 2nd and 5th Battalions sat in grim silence, their faces blackened with camouflage paint, their hands gripping rifles that would soon write their names in blood across the German fortifications of Point du Hoc. The night had been filled with the thunderous roar of 12,000 Allied aircraft, their shadows blotting out the stars as they carried paratroopers deep into occupied France. Now, as the massive armada of 6,000 ships approached the Normandy coast, Rudder could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon them all. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was about to begin. 30 minutes to the beach, shouted the coxswain over the howling wind and crashing waves. The landing craft pitched violently in the choppy seas, and several Rangers leaned over the sides, their stomachs rebelling against the combination of fear and seasickness. Sergeant First Class Leonard Lomel, a coal miner's son from New Jersey, checked his Tommy gun for the 100th time and glanced at the rope coils and grappling hooks that would carry them up the 100-foot cliffs of Point du Hoc. The intelligence reports had been clear and terrifying in their simplicity. 6 massive German guns, each capable of hurling shells 25 miles, sat atop those cliffs. If those guns remained operational when the main invasion force hit Utah and Omaha beaches, thousands of American soldiers would die before they could establish a foothold on Hitler's Fortress Europe. The Rangers' mission was simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution: scale the cliffs under enemy fire and destroy those guns before they could rain death upon their comrades. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive study D-Day, June 6, 1944, the pre-invasion bombardment had begun at 5:30 in the morning, with Allied warships unleashing a fury that shook the very foundations of the Atlantic Wall. Through the growing light, Rudder could see the massive battleship Texas, her 16-inch guns belching flame and smoke as she pounded the German positions. The heavy cruiser Satterlee added her voice to the deadly chorus, her 8-inch shells screaming overhead toward the concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that crowned the cliff. But even as the bombardment raged, Rudder knew that many of the German defenders would survive in their deep bunkers, waiting to emerge when the first Rangers set foot on the narrow beach below. The men around him represented the cream of American fighting forces. They had trained for months in the Scottish Highlands, scaling cliffs in all weather conditions, perfecting the techniques that would carry them up the sheer rock face of Point du Hoc. Each man carried 90 pounds of equipment: weapons, ammunition, demolition charges, medical supplies, and the precious rope ladders and scaling equipment that meant the difference between success and failure. Corporal Salva Maimon from New York adjusted the rocket-fired grappling hook strapped to his pack. These ingenious devices, borrowed from the London Fire Department and modified for military use, would fire rope ladders up to the cliff tops, providing the Rangers with their primary means of ascent. But Maimon knew, as they all knew, that everything depended on reaching the base of those cliffs alive. The German defenders of Point du Hoc were no ordinary troops. The 716th Infantry Regiment, reinforced by elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment, had spent months fortifying their positions. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, while mortars and artillery pieces could rain down death upon anyone foolish enough to assault their impregnable fortress. As the landing craft pitched through the heavy swells, Rudder made his final preparations. The success of Operation Overlord hung in the balance, and 225 American Rangers were about to write one of the most heroic chapters in military history. The first Ranger to die at Point du Hoc never made it to the beach. As the landing craft approached the narrow strip of rocky shoreline at the base of the cliffs, German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions among the crater-scarred rocks. Private First Class Otto Stevens from Ohio pitched forward into the icy water, his blood mingling with the foam as his comrades pressed forward through the surf. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's boots hit the shingle at exactly 7:10 in the morning, 40 minutes behind schedule due to the rough seas and navigation difficulties that had plagued the small fleet of landing craft around him. Rangers dug for whatever cover they could find among the jumbled rocks and shell craters that littered the narrow beach. The German defenders, protected in their concrete bunkers high above, poured down a murderous fire that turned The water red and filled the air with the screams of wounded men. Sergeant Leonard Lomel, his face streaked with blood from a shell fragment, grabbed one of the rocket-fired grappling hooks and aimed it toward the cliff face. The device fired with a sharp crack, sending its rope ladder arcing upward through the smoke and flying lead. But the rope, soaked by hours in the spray-filled landing craft, fell short of the cliff top, dangling uselessly against the scarred rock face 30 feet above the beach. "The ropes are too wet," shouted Corporal Frank Rapinski over the din of battle. "They were heavy to reach the top all along the beach." Rangers were discovering the same devastating problem. The equipment that had worked perfectly in training was failing them in their moment of greatest need, but Rudder's men were not ordinary soldiers. While some Rangers continued to fire rocket-fired grapples, others began the seemingly impossible task of free-climbing the vertical cliff face. Using their bare hands and the few crevices and shell holes that pocked the limestone, they began to inch their way upward under constant fire. From above, Private First Class Harry Fate from Pennsylvania had made it 20 feet up the cliff when a German potato masher grenade exploded just above his head. The concussion slammed him against the rock face, and for a moment he hung there, stunned and bleeding, but his grip held, and after shaking his head to clear it, he continued climbing upward, following the faint trail blazed by Rangers ahead of him. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew their backs were to the wall. Staff Sergeant Heinrich Mueller of the 716th Infantry Regiment directed the fire of 3 machine gun nests from his command post in Bunker 17 as he watched the American Rangers climb their way up the cliff face. Like human spiders, he called down artillery fire from the inland batteries, turning the beach into a hellscape of exploding shells and flying rock fragments. By 7:45, the first Rangers had reached the top of the cliff. Lieutenant Theodore Roosevelt Parker, a distant cousin of the former president, pulled himself over the edge and immediately came under fire from a German machine gun position. 30 yards away, without hesitation, he charged the bunker, his Thompson submachine gun chattering as he advanced. The German crew, caught by surprise at the sudden appearance of an American soldier, where none should have been able to climb, fell back in confusion. Behind Parker came Sergeant Lomel and a growing stream of Rangers who had found handholds and footholds in the shattered cliff face. Each man who reached the top immediately came under fire, but their very presence atop the supposedly impregnable position sent shock waves through the German command structure. The landscape that greeted the Rangers bore no resemblance to the peaceful Norman countryside they had studied in photographs. The pre-invasion bombardment had turned Point du Hoc into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, some so large that entire buildings could have been hidden within them. Twisted steel and concrete debris littered the ground, while the acrid smell of high explosives mixed with the stench of death. But where were the guns? The massive coastal artillery pieces that had been the primary target of their desperate assault were nowhere to be seen. In their place, the Rangers found elaborate wooden decoys, carefully constructed to fool Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The real guns, they would later discover, had been moved inland weeks earlier, hidden in apple orchards and behind stone farmhouses, where they could still threaten the invasion beaches. Captain Ralph Goranson, leading the 2nd Ranger Battalion's assault on the eastern side of the point, gathered his surviving men around the largest shell crater. Of the 65 Rangers who had started the climb with him, only 42 had made it to the top. The others lay dead or wounded on the beach below, or hung motionless from the cliff face, their life's blood seeping into the Norman stone. "We hold what we've taken," Goranson ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting commands over the din of battle. "No matter what comes at us, we hold this ground." Around him, Rangers began digging defensive positions in the soft earth of the shell craters, using their entrenching tools and bare hands to create foxholes that might keep them alive. Through the counterattacks that were sure to come by 8:30 in the morning, 150 Rangers had reached the top of Point du Hoc, but their position was precarious in the extreme. German reinforcements were already moving toward their position from inland strongpoints, while artillery fire from hidden gun positions began to zero in on the captured ground. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, blood streaming from a shrapnel wound in his leg, established his command post in the largest shell crater and tried to make sense of the chaotic battlefield around him. The radio operator, Corporal James Eichner from Minnesota, worked frantically to establish communication with the naval forces offshore. The Rangers desperately needed supporting fire from the big guns of the Texas and Arkansas if they were going to hold their tenuous foothold. but the radio, damaged during the assault, could only transmit intermittently, and Eichner's calls for help often went unanswered in the electronic chaos of the invasion. Sergeant Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn had taken it upon themselves to locate and destroy the real German guns, moving south from the point through a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. They advanced carefully through fields of overlapping shell craters, every sense alert for the sound of approaching German infantry. Their mission had evolved from capturing gun positions to finding guns that weren't where intelligence had said they would be. The two Rangers had covered nearly a mile inland when they stumbled upon an extraordinary sight. Hidden in a small apple orchard behind a stone wall, 5 of the 6 missing German guns sat unguarded, their barrels pointed toward Utah Beach, where American forces were fighting to establish their beachhead. Boxes of ammunition were stacked nearby, and the guns were clearly ready for action, waiting only for their crews to return from whatever bunkers they had sheltered in during the bombardment. Without hesitation, Lommel and Kuhn set about their deadly work. Using thermite grenades from their assault packs, they destroyed the traversing mechanisms of 2 guns, rendering them permanently inoperable. Then, moving with the efficiency born of intensive training, they smashed the optical sights and fired rifle grenades into the breeches of the remaining weapons. Meanwhile, back at Point Du Hoc, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Major Cleveland Lytle, second in command of the force, had been wounded by mortar fire and evacuated to an aid station set up in the ruins of a German bunker. Captain Otto Masny of the 5th Ranger Battalion had taken over the eastern section of the perimeter, but his force had been reduced to fewer than 30 effective fighters. The German counterattack began at 9:15 with a barrage of mortar fire that sent Rangers diving for the deepest shell craters they could find. Then came the infantry, soldiers of the 914th Grenadier Regiment advancing in small groups through the churned earth, using every fold in the ground and every pile of rubble for cover as they closed in on the American positions. Corporal Salva Maimon, positioned in a crater on the northern edge of the perimeter, opened fire with his Browning automatic rifle as German soldiers appeared among the ruins of a demolished observation post 50 yards away. His disciplined burst of fire dropped to attackers, but more kept coming, and soon he could hear the distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles as enemy marksmen found concealed positions. Among the debris, Private First Class Otto Masny, no relation to Captain Masny despite sharing a surname, had established himself in what had once been a German communications bunker. The concrete structure, though damaged by naval gunfire, still provided excellent protection, and from its firing slits, he could observe much of the approach routes the Germans would have to use. His Springfield rifle, fitted with a telescopic sight, became a deadly instrument as he picked off German squad leaders and machine gunners who exposed themselves during the attack. The fighting was intensely personal, conducted at ranges where men could see their enemies' faces. Rangers and German soldiers engaged in deadly duels among the shell craters using grenades, rifle fire, and sometimes bayonets and entrenching tools. When the combat became hand-to-hand, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the coppery scent of blood and the sickly sweet odor of high explosives. Lieutenant Parker, who had been among the first to reach the cliff top, now found himself commanding a mixed group of Rangers from both battalions. His position, centered around the ruins of the German command bunker, came under particularly heavy attack as German infantry tried to recapture the high ground that dominated the entire point. Parker moved constantly among his men, appearing at critical moments to direct fire or help repel a particularly dangerous probe. By 10 o'clock, ammunition was running dangerously low. Rangers were stripping cartridges from the bodies of dead Germans, and several men were down to their last few rounds. Corporal Eichner continued his desperate attempts to establish reliable radio communication with the ships offshore, finally managing to get through to the Arkansas with a fire mission that brought 12-inch shells screaming down on German assembly areas 500 yards inland. The naval gunfire broke up the most serious German counterattack, but Rudder knew his men could not hold indefinitely. They were outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Yet retreat was impossible. The narrow beach below offered no sanctuary, only the killing ground where so many Rangers had already died out as the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher over the Norman coast. The Rangers at Point Du Hoc continued to hold their precarious perimeter, each man knowing that their sacrifice was buying precious time for the thousands of Allied soldiers fighting to establish beachheads along the coast. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cratered landscape of Point du Hoc as Lieutenant Colonel Rudder counted his remaining effective fighters. Of the 225 Rangers who had begun the assault that morning, fewer than 90 were still capable of sustained combat. The rest lay dead among the shell craters or had been evacuated to the makeshift aid station that Dr. Walter Block had established in the ruins of a German bunker. Dr. Block, a soft-spoken physician from Chicago who had volunteered for Ranger training, despite being 34 years old, worked tirelessly to save the wounded. His medical supplies, carried up the cliff in waterproof bags, were nearly exhausted, and he was reduced to using German bandages and morphine captured from enemy aid stations. The doctor moved through the perimeter with complete disregard for his own safety, treating wounded Rangers wherever they fell. The German pressure continued unabated. Colonel Rudolf Bacher, commanding the defense of this sector of the Atlantic Wall, had committed his reserve battalion to eliminating the American penetration. From his command post 3 miles inland, he directed a carefully coordinated attack that combined infantry assault with precise artillery fire from the hidden gun positions that Lommel and Kuhn had not yet discovered. Sergeant First Class William Courtney, a former steel worker from Pittsburgh, had taken command of the southern section of the perimeter after his lieutenant had been killed by sniper fire. From his position in what had once been a German ammunition bunker, he could observe the approaches from 3 directions. His men, mostly survivors from the 1st Platoon of Dog Company, had learned to husband their ammunition carefully, taking only the shots that counted. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the Germans launched their most determined assault yet. 3 companies of infantry, supported by mortar fire and preceded by a carefully planned artillery barrage, advanced across the broken ground toward the Ranger positions. The attacking force included veterans of the Russian front, men who had learned the deadly art of urban warfare in the ruins of Stalingrad and knew how to use every shell crater and pile of rubble to their advantage. Corporal Frank Rapinski, manning a Browning automatic rifle in the northwestern section of the perimeter, opened fire as the first German soldiers appeared through the smoke of the artillery barrage. His position, a shallow crater that had once been a German machine gun nest, offered minimal protection, but it commanded excellent fields of fire across the most likely approach routes. The battle raged with an intensity that few of the Rangers had experienced even in their most rigorous training. German stick grenades arced through the air to explode among the American positions, while Rangers responded with fragmentation grenades and rifle fire. The sounds of combat merged into a continuous roar punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the sharp crack of sniper rifles. Private First Class Charles Neighbor, a quiet farm boy from Iowa, found himself face to face with a German soldier in the bottom of a shell crater 30 yards from the main perimeter. Both men had been advancing toward what they thought was an unoccupied position. When they encountered each other at point-blank range, the German, a sergeant in the 900 at 14th Regiment, was quicker with his rifle, but his shot went high in his excitement. Neighbor's return shot did not miss, as referenced in the detailed analysis found in the Guns at Last Light by Rick Atkinson. The fighting at Point du Hoc represented one of the most sustained, small unit actions of the entire Normandy campaign. The tide began to turn when Sergeant Lommel and Staff Sergeant Kuhn returned from their successful mission to destroy the hidden guns. Moving carefully through the German lines, using their knowledge of small unit tactics and the confusion of battle, they had managed to locate and destroy the 6th and final gun. Before beginning their dangerous journey back to the Ranger perimeter, their arrival brought more than just the news of mission accomplished. They also carried intelligence about German troop dispositions and the location of several enemy strong points that were directing fire against the Ranger positions. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder immediately incorporated this information into his defensive plans, shifting men to counter the most dangerous threats. Captain Ralph Goranson, his left arm in a makeshift sling from a mortar fragment wound, led a counterattack against a German machine gun position that had been causing heavy casualties. Taking 5 Rangers with him, he worked his way through a series of connecting shell craters until he was within grenade range of the enemy position. The assault was swift and deadly. Within minutes, the German machine gun was silent and its crew lay dead among their weapons. But the Rangers' situation remained desperate. Ammunition was critically low, with many men down to fewer than a dozen rounds each. The medical supplies were completely exhausted, and Dr. Block was treating Wounded men with supplies scavenged from German positions. Water was running short, and several Rangers were showing signs of combat exhaustion after more than 8 hours of continuous fighting. The radio finally crackled to life with news that changed everything. Corporal Ackner, his patience and technical skill finally rewarded, established solid contact with the command ship anchoring offshore. Within minutes, supporting fire from the battleship Arkansas began falling on German assembly areas, breaking up another forming attack. More importantly, the radio brought word that relief was on the way. Elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion, having successfully completed their mission at Omaha Beach, were fighting their way inland toward Point Du Hoc, but they were still miles away, and it was unclear whether Rudder's depleted force could hold out until help arrived. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-soaked battlefield, the Rangers at Point Du Hoc prepared for what might be their final stand. The evening of June 6th brought no respite to the Rangers, clinging to their positions atop Point Du Hoc. As darkness fell across the Norman countryside, the character of the battle changed from the desperate daylight fighting to a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out among the shell craters and ruined bunkers. German infiltrators, trained in night combat techniques learned on the Eastern Front, began probing the American positions with grenades and submachine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, despite his wounds and exhaustion, continued to move among his men, offering encouragement and redistributing the dwindling ammunition supplies. His command post, established in the ruins of what had been the German commander's bunker, bore little resemblance to the tactical operations centers described in field manuals. Maps were spread on ammunition boxes. Communications were maintained by runners crawling through shell craters, and major tactical decisions were made by the light of captured German flashlights. Sergeant Lommel, now recognized as the hero who had destroyed the German guns, took command of the most exposed position on the eastern edge of the perimeter. His handful of Rangers, some of them wounded but still able to fight, represented the thin line between the main German force and the American positions. Every sound in the darkness could represent approaching enemy soldiers, and the Rangers learned to distinguish between the rustle of wind through the debris and the careful footsteps of infiltrators. The German tactics had evolved throughout the day. Colonel Bachrer, frustrated by his inability to dislodge the stubborn Americans, had ordered his men to adopt the techniques that had proven successful against Soviet positions. In urban warfare, small groups of soldiers, armed with automatic weapons and satchel charges, would creep forward through the darkness, attempting to get close enough to the Ranger positions to cause maximum damage. With surprise attacks. Private First Class Robert Fruehling, a former hunter from Montana, whose skills with a rifle had made him one of the most effective marksmen in the battalion, had positioned himself in the ruins of an observation post that offered excellent fields of fire but minimal protection. Throughout the night, he engaged in deadly duels with German snipers who were trying to pick off Rangers, exposed by muzzle flashes or the brief flare of cigarette lighters. The medical situation had become critical. Dr. Bloch, working without adequate light or proper facilities, continued to treat wounded men who should have been evacuated hours earlier. His aid station, located in a partially collapsed bunker, resembled a scene from a field hospital during the Civil War more than a modern medical facility. Yet his calm professionalism and skill kept men alive who would have died without his care. Corporal Salva Memo found himself in command of what had once been First Squad when his sergeant was killed by German mortar fire just after midnight. The responsibility weighed heavily on the young soldier from New York, but he quickly adapted to the demands of combat leadership. His position, anchored around a destroyed German machine gun nest, controlled one of the key approaches to the Ranger perimeter. At 2 o'clock in the morning of June 7th, the Germans launched what would be their final major attack. Using the cover of darkness and a brief but intense mortar barrage, 2 companies of infantry advanced across the broken ground in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the weakened American positions. The attack was preceded by infiltrators, who had worked their way to within grenade range of several Ranger positions. The fighting that followed was perhaps the most intense of the entire battle. German soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, pressed their attack with skill and determination. They used captured American equipment, including Thompson submachine guns taken from Rangers killed during the day, and their familiarity with the battlefield gave them significant advantages in the darkness. Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, Lommel's partner in the mission to destroy the guns, found himself cut off from the main Ranger force when German infiltrators occupied a shell crater directly behind his position. For nearly an hour, he and the other Rangers held their isolated position while enemy soldiers attempted to work their way closer through the maze of craters and debris. The battle was decided by the arrival of naval gunfire directed by Corporal Eichner, who had finally managed to establish reliable communication with the offshore fire support ships. The battleship Arkansas, guided by Eichner's precise spotting reports, dropped 12-inch shells into the German assembly areas with devastating effect. The heavy naval gunfire, combined with the determined resistance of the Rangers, broke up the attack and sent the surviving German soldiers retreating into the darkness. As dawn approached on June 7th, Lieutenant Colonel Rudder could count fewer than 60 Rangers still capable of effective combat. The perimeter had shrunk to a few hundred yards in diameter, centered around the ruins of the main German command bunker, but they still held the high ground, and the mission had been accomplished. The German guns that could have devastated the invasion beaches had been destroyed, and the Rangers had tied down significant German forces that might otherwise have been used to counterattack the main beachheads. The sound that greeted the dawn was not the crack of rifle fire or the explosion of mortar shells, but the rumble of tracked vehicles approaching from the direction of Omaha Beach. Captain John Ron, leading elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion that had fought their way inland from the invasion beaches, appeared at the edge of the Ranger perimeter just as the sun broke through the morning clouds. "You boys look like you could use some help," Ron called out as his Rangers spread out to reinforce the battered perimeter. Behind him came medics, ammunition, water, and most importantly, the knowledge that the Rangers of Point Du Hoc had not been forgotten. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, his uniform torn and bloodstained, his face gray with exhaustion, managed a tired smile as he greeted the relief force of the 225 Rangers who had begun the assault 36 hours earlier. Only 6 to 7 were still able to fight, but they had accomplished their mission and held their ground against overwhelming odds. The relief of Point Du Hoc marked the end of one of the most remarkable small unit actions in American military history, but the cost had been staggering. As Captain Ron's reinforcements secured the perimeter and began the grim task of caring for the wounded and counting the dead, the full scope of the Rangers' sacrifice became clear. 58 Rangers had been killed in action and another 107 wounded, many of them so severely that they would never return to combat. Dr. Block, who had worked tirelessly for more than 30 hours without rest, finally allowed himself to be relieved by the medical personnel who arrived. With the relief force, his aid station had saved the lives of dozens of Rangers who would otherwise have died from their wounds, and his calm presence under fire had been an inspiration to every man who saw him work. The doctor's uniform was stained with the blood of his patients, and his hands shook with exhaustion as he briefed his replacement on the condition of the wounded. Still under his care, Sergeant Leonard Lomel, the coal miner's son who had become the hero of Point Du Hoc, was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in locating and destroying the German guns. His quiet competence and deadly effectiveness had made him a legend among the Rangers, but the recognition meant less to him than the knowledge that his mission had been accomplished. Years later, he would say that he had simply done what any Ranger would have done in the same situation. The German defenders had also paid a heavy price for their stubborn resistance. More than 200 soldiers of the 716th Infantry Regiment and the 914th Grenadier Regiment had been killed or wounded in the fighting, and their carefully prepared positions lay in ruins. Colonel Backerer, the German commander who had directed the defense, was captured by advancing American forces 2 days later, his uniform torn and his spirit broken by the failure to dislodge the Rangers from their precarious foothold. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, evacuated to England for treatment of his wounds, would later be promoted to full colonel and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the assault. His calm direction of the battle and his refusal to consider retreat had been the crucial factors that enabled the Rangers to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. But like many combat veterans, he would carry the weight of command for the rest of his life, remembering not the medals and promotions, but the faces of the young men who had not survived the assault. The strategic importance of the Ranger mission at Point Du Hoc extended far beyond the destruction of 6 German guns. The assault had tied down an entire German regiment that might otherwise have been used to counterattack the main invasion beaches. More importantly, It had demonstrated to both sides that the supposedly impregnable Atlantic Wall could be breached by determined attackers willing to accept heavy casualties. As referenced in the official U.S. Army historical study Omaha Beach Head, the success at Point Du Hoc was one of the few completely successful tactical operations of D-Day, accomplished exactly as planned despite devastating casualties. Private First Class Harry Fate, who had continued climbing after being stunned by a German grenade, was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during the assault. His determination to reach the top of the cliff despite his wounds had inspired other Rangers to continue their seemingly impossible climb, and his courage under fire had been typical of the extraordinary heroism displayed by ordinary soldiers. Throughout the battle, the weapons captured at Point Du Hoc provided valuable intelligence about German defensive preparations along the entire Atlantic Wall. The concrete bunkers, though heavily damaged by naval gunfire, revealed construction techniques and defensive concepts that would prove useful in planning future assaults against fortified positions. The German maps and documents found in the command bunkers showed the extent of the defensive preparations and the locations of other strong points along the coast. Captain Ralph Goranson, who had led the assault on the eastern side of the point, was evacuated to England with wounds that would keep him hospitalized for 3 months. His aggressive leadership and tactical skill had been crucial factors in the success of the mission, and his counterattack against the German machine gun position had eliminated one of the most dangerous threats to the Ranger perimeter. The Rangers, who survived Point Du Hoc, would go on to fight in some of the most difficult battles of the European campaign. Many of them participated in the assault on Brest, the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, and the final advance into Germany. But for all of them, the battle at Point Du Hoc would remain the defining moment of their military service. The day when they had proven that American soldiers could accomplish the impossible when properly led and motivated. The narrow beach at the base of the cliffs, littered with the debris of war and stained with the blood of heroes, was transformed by the Corps of Engineers into a supply depot that would support the advancing Allied armies. Landing craft brought in ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements, while the dead were reverently removed for burial in the temporary cemeteries that were springing up throughout the invasion area. The French civilians in the nearby village of Crick-Valembessin, who had endured for years of German occupation, emerged from their cellars to find their liberators exhausted, bloodied, but victorious. The sight of American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, who had sacrificed so much for the freedom of people they had never met, moved many of the villagers to tears. 3 days after the assault, as the sound of gunfire faded across the Norman countryside and the great invasion moved inland toward its ultimate objectives, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished at Point Du Hoc began to emerge. The Rangers had not merely captured a strategic position, they had written a new chapter in the history of American arms, demonstrating that extraordinary courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, visited the battlefield on June 9th and was sobered by what he found. The cratered landscape, littered with the debris of battle and marked by hastily dug graves, bore witness to one of the most savage small unit actions of the war. Bradley, himself a veteran of the North African and Sicilian campaigns, called the Ranger assault the most difficult and dangerous mission of D-Day. The strategic objectives of Operation Overlord had been achieved, but at a cost that would resonate through American military history for generations to come. The Rangers at Point Du Hoc had demonstrated that elite units, properly trained and motivated, could accomplish missions that seemed beyond the capability of conventional forces. Their success would influence American military doctrine for decades, leading to the expansion of special operations forces and the development of new techniques for assault operations against fortified positions. Sergeant First Class William Courtney, the steel worker from Pittsburgh who had commanded the southern section of the perimeter, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the German counterattacks. His steady leadership and tactical skill had been crucial factors in holding the Ranger positions during the most critical moments of the battle. Years later, he would return to his job at the steel mill, but the memories of Point Du Hoc would remain with him for the rest of his life. The German perspective on the battle was one of grudging respect for an enemy who had accomplished what their own military experts had deemed impossible. General Major Dietrich Krase, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, wrote in his final report that the American Rangers had displayed exceptional courage and tactical skill in their assault on the supposedly impregnable position. The failure to hold Point du Hoc was seen by many German officers as a harbinger of the ultimate defeat that awaited the Third Reich. Corporal James Eichner, whose skill with the radio had provided the crucial naval gunfire support that saved the Rangers during the final German assault, was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Bronze Star. His technical competence and cool performance under fire had been typical of the high standards maintained by every Ranger throughout the battle. The communications equipment he had maintained under the most difficult conditions had been the lifeline that connected the isolated Rangers to the massive Allied fleet offshore. The French government, grateful for the sacrifice made by American soldiers on French soil, erected a monument at Point du Hoc that still stands today. The simple granite marker, overlooking the English Channel where the invasion fleet had assembled for its rendezvous with history, bears the names of the Rangers who died in the assault. French schoolchildren still visit the site to learn about the day when young Americans climbed impossible cliffs to bring freedom to occupied Europe. Private First Class Otto Masny, whose marksmanship from the German communications bunker had been crucial in breaking up several enemy attacks, returned to his home in Wisconsin after the war. He seldom spoke about his experiences at Point du Hoc, preferring to let others tell the story of what the Rangers had accomplished. Like many combat veterans, he found that the intensity of battle could never be adequately conveyed to those who had not experienced it firsthand. The tactical lessons learned at Point du Hoc influenced American military planning for the remainder of the war. The successful use of rocket-fired grappling hooks, despite their initial problems with wet ropes, led to improvements in the equipment that would be used in subsequent assault operations. The value of intensive training in realistic conditions was demonstrated by the Rangers' ability to adapt when their primary assault techniques failed, falling back on individual initiative and basic climbing skills to accomplish their mission. Dr. Walter Block, whose medical heroism had saved dozens of lives during the battle, was awarded the Silver Star and later the French Croix de Guerre. After the war, he returned to his medical practice in Chicago, but he remained in contact with many of the Rangers whose lives he had saved. His quiet professionalism and courage under fire had embodied the highest traditions of military medicine, and his example would inspire a generation of combat medics. The intelligence gathered from captured German documents at Point du Hoc revealed the extent of the Atlantic Wall's defensive preparations and provided valuable information for planning future operations. Maps showing the locations of other coastal fortifications, ammunition storage sites, and communication centers helped Allied forces prepare for the difficult fighting that lay ahead. As they pushed inland from the invasion beaches, Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, Lomel's partner in the crucial mission to destroy the hidden guns, was also awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His calm courage and tactical skill had been essential to the success of the most important single action of the entire assault. Years later, military historians would debate whether the invasion could have succeeded if those guns had remained operational. But there was no doubt that Kuhn and Lomel had eliminated a threat that could have caused thousands of casualties. The cost of victory at Point du Hoc extended beyond the immediate casualties suffered during the assault. Many of the Rangers who survived carried physical and psychological wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The intensity of the combat, the loss of close friends, and the constant stress of fighting against overwhelming odds left scars that no medal could heal. Yet they had accomplished their mission and proven that American soldiers could match any enemy in courage and determination. The German prisoners captured at Point du Hoc provided valuable intelligence about enemy defensive tactics and morale. Many of them expressed surprise at the tenacity and skill displayed by the American Rangers, having been told by their officers that American soldiers were soft and would break under pressure. The reality they encountered was far different, and their reports to Allied interrogators provided insights into German defensive preparations that proved useful in subsequent operations. Captain Otto Masny, no relation to Private Masny despite the shared surname, recovered from his wounds and led his company in the fighting around St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge 6 months later. The leadership skills he had developed during the desperate defense of Point du Hoc served him well in that later battle, where American forces again found themselves outnumbered and fighting for survival against determined German attacks. The Rangers who fell at Point Du Hoc were initially buried in temporary graves near the battlefield, their sacrifice marked by simple wooden crosses bearing their names and units. Later, many were moved to the permanent American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, where they rest among the thousands of other American soldiers who died during the Normandy campaign. Their graves, marked by white marble crosses arranged in perfect rows, overlook the beaches where the Great Invasion began. The legacy of Point Du Hoc extends far beyond the immediate tactical success of the mission. The Rangers' achievement demonstrated that elite units, properly trained and led, could accomplish missions that seemed impossible to conventional forces. This lesson would influence American military doctrine for decades, leading to the expansion of special operations forces and the development of new techniques for conducting difficult assault operations. As the sun set on June 10, 1944, over the now quiet battlefield of Point Du Hoc, the full significance of what had been accomplished began to emerge. 225 young Americans had climbed impossible cliffs under enemy fire, destroyed the weapons that threatened their comrades, and held their positions against overwhelming odds. Their sacrifice had been an essential part of the larger victory that would ultimately liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. The Rangers at Point Du Hoc had proven that ordinary men, when called upon to do extraordinary things, could rise to heights of courage and determination that they never knew they possessed. Their story would inspire future generations of American soldiers and serve as a permanent reminder that freedom's price must sometimes be paid in blood by those brave enough to climb the cliffs that others deem unscalable. In the decades that followed, as the world changed and new conflicts arose, the example set by the Rangers at Point Du Hoc would continue to inspire American military forces. Their legacy lived on not just in the medals and monuments erected in their honor, but in the enduring principle that no mission is impossible when undertaken by soldiers willing to sacrifice everything for their comrades and their cause. The thin line of heroes who scaled the cliffs of Point Du Hoc on that June morning had written their names in history with their blood, their courage, and their unwavering determination to accomplish the impossible. Their story would endure as long as men remembered what it meant to serve something greater than themselves, and their example would light the way for future generations who would face their own impossible cliffs and find the strength to climb them.